Now, real Alex Ruby is described here as an investigative reporter, but that doesn't tell you half of it. He is a wizard at investigative reporting, a brilliant writer, a brilliant investigator, and working at the most brilliant of all the investigative reporting bureau in the world today, the one and only Grey Zone News. Alex Rubinstein joins us again now here on the mother of all talk shows. Alex, we want to talk about the situation that now exists on targeted assassinations. Let me set the context. The authorities, not any outliers, the authorities in Kiev have announced that having blown up the daughter of somebody they didn't like, having blown up a blogger in a St. Petersburg cafe, having now blown up and gravely wounded a novelist inside Russia and killed his driver, that the Ukrainian regime intends to attack and kill Russians and their propagandists anywhere in the world. That sounds like a declaration of war throughout the world, international terrorism to me. How do they get away with that?
Well, they get away with it because the entire NATO order is on their side, and Blinken himself, Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, has essentially greenlit attacks inside of Russian territory by Ukraine, asked by David Ignatius in relation to the second attempt on Vladimir Putin's life via the drone attack on the Kremlin building, whether the U.S. would criticize such attacks inside Russia. Anthony Blinken said in response that this was a decision for Ukraine to make for itself, and essentially that the U.S. has no role. I don't buy that. I don't believe that Volodymyr Zelensky can even use the bathroom without approval from the United States. But you see this kind of escalating attacks inside Russian territory. Many of them don't get reported outside of Russia, and I found one incident in the course of one day. A Telegram news channel in Russia documented 10 attacks in just one day on the border region. But so most of them are confined to the border region, but you have these ones that do go further into Russia. You have these car bombings. You have the bombing of a public event in St. Petersburg at a cafe. And it's, you have to imagine that Ukraine is resorting to these kinds of tactics because it's not able to win in a sense of conventional warfare.
So what we're talking about is ISIS 2.0, really. This is the counteroffensive, a new wave of ISIS-style terror attacks.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And again, you see this war targeting intellectuals. And so it's not just going after, rank and file soldiers. It's an attempt to win the information war by assassinations. So it is really sick, and it is the same kind of thing that ISIS would do. For example, taking out religious leaders of opposing Islamic sects, of opposing religions, and waging that kind of psychological campaign against their adversaries. And one other similarity that I would point out is the use in these attacks by ISIS and by the Ukrainian Secret Service of Western-made weapons. You had, for example, in the first assassination attempt on Russian President Vladimir Putin, a Ukrainian-made drone that was strapped with Canadian-made C4 explosives. You've had in these drone incursions in the border region many documented incidents of American Switchblade drones being used, and these are very easy ways of taking out civilian infrastructure and conducting psychological terror on the Russian population. For example, you can probably buy a commercial drone for, say, $800 USD spend a few more $100s on C4 explosives and duct tape them together. So you see this kind of guerrilla tactics that are, really meant to terrorize the Russian population. And I just don't think that I think that it changes the calculus because there's going to be a situation where if these drone incursions continue, the Russian population is going to become even more supportive than they already are of the war because the war is coming within their territory. So it really opens the door for further escalation. It is itself escalatory, not to mention how the Russian government has not attempted to take out Volodymyr Zelensky. They've kind of let him be, and now Ukraine is making attempts on the life of their president. You can see that it's almost intended to provoke a response, to escalate, and it really drives home the message that you put out just before this interview right now.
Well, of course, it hasn't worked up till now. I mean, Vladimir Putin is showing almost Chinese levels of inscrutability. The playing down of a drone landing on your roof from in the most fortified place in Moscow, the heart of government in Moscow for hundreds of years, in all political systems. No retaliation for it. Putin would have been fully entitled to, under the self-defense strictures of international law, to react, but has not. This extraordinary forbearance, is it popular in Russia, or is the president under pressure to go much further and harder?
Well, I'm not so sure. I don't follow the polling, on a regular basis. But what I would say is that Russia has not in the past been shy of responding. For example, when the Ukrainians conducted a suicide bombing of the Kerch Bridge, Russia responded by, for the first time, targeting Ukrainian infrastructure in a meaningful way by taking out their electricity system. So one has to wonder with specifically the second attempt on Vladimir Putin's life, whether it was intended to provoke a response, whether it was almost an attempt to have the Russians target Zelensky so that he could be replaced. That's kind of where my mind goes with this, because otherwise it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. As for the Russian view of this, again, I don't think it's going to be tenable. I raise this issue repeatedly. Imagine for a moment where Russia is providing weapons and equipment to Cuba to conduct drone attacks from the area spanning from Florida to Washington, D.C., to the White House itself. Cuba would be obliterated overnight. So Russia has not done that. You almost have to admire the restraint that they're showing. But on the other hand, you have an adversary in Ukraine where, as I've pointed out in my recent articles on national media, you have open calls for terror attacks. You had this Ukrainian banker, Volodymyr Yatsenko, who is a fraudster who funneled billions of dollars from the average Ukrainian citizens' bank accounts into that of Igor Kolomoisky, the main financial backer of Zelensky and of the Azov Battalion. And he's going on Kolomoisky-owned national television calling for basically putting out a bounty for terror attacks on Red Square on Victory Day. He offered $500,000 USD, $500,000, for any drone manufacturer that could attack that parade. And then you have just days later this UNIAN news agency. It's partnered with Western outlets like Der Spiegel, the BBC, lots of high profile international media outlets they have relations with. and they put out a poll on their Telegram channel after the car bombing of Zakhar Prilipin, if I'm saying his name incorrectly, I apologize, asking which Russian intellectual should be next, and giving a list of like 6 or so names, including Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief of RT News. So these are not just people that have writing backgrounds or journalistic backgrounds and have put on military fatigues, but actual journalists working inside Russia, have not been participants in the war. And again, it just drives home the level of psychological terror that the Ukrainians are putting out on wide across their own country through their biggest media outlets.
Well, I recently picked through the still extant rubble of the television station in Belgrade, which NATO unashamedly bombed in the middle of the night, killing tea ladies and makeup girls, as well as journalists and broadcasters. And that rubble is there as a monument. So what you're really saying, Alex, is we are against terrorism, except where the terrorists are our terrorists, and we're for journalism not being a crime, except when it's journalists of whom we disapprove, from Julian Assange in the dungeons at Belmarsh to Russian journalists who can be murdered with impunity, even using Western-supplied weapons, and there will be no condemnation or even note of regret issued from Western capitals. There's a word for all this, isn't there? With a capital H, hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's right. And again, just to drive home this point of a situation, an imaginary one where Cuba was being armed. I mean, that would by Russia to attack the U.S. That would be not only Cuba's own death sentence, but it would be considered an open declaration of war by Russia against the U.S. So, again, it just shows the level of restraint that Putin is not responding in kind, and it shows over and over again that the West has no interest in de-escalating this war and making a ceasefire, making some kind of peace agreement. They only want to escalate, and they're doing whatever they can and supporting Ukraine in doing whatever it can to ensure that this only becomes more and more deadly for the people of Ukraine and disastrous for the economies in Europe, the United States, and everywhere else. This is going to be a paradigm shift on a level that we have not seen, and it's going to leave Ukraine basically a giant version of this news station that you just described, completely leveled and ready to be bought up by foreign investors.